Let's turn to property. With interest rates on hold and seemingly some stability for mortgage holders ahead, remains a political hot potato in Australia, given talk from the government and other members about perhaps changes to capital gains tax, negative gearing, limiting investor portfolio size. Let's unpack it all. Anthony Landahl joining us from Equilibria Finance. Anthony, good to see you.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, political hot potatoes sure is. No government willing to touch, capital gains or negative gearing, or are they perhaps? And I've read, some analysis here. If they did, what effect would it have? Maybe negligible. What's your view of it?
Yeah, it's come up as part of, I guess, the political environment at the moment. The government's trying to get their new housing scheme up and running, where they're essentially their equity scheme, where they're subsidising up to 40% of new purchase and 30% of existing properties. The Greens have raised the negative gearing changes as well as possible changes to CGT. When this was proposed, you could argue it's sort of been a bit of a sleeper for the Labor Party, so politically potentially problematical. Last time they looked at it, they were looking at capital gains tax concessions dropping to 25%, and the Greens are proposing that negative gearing be limited to one investment property per household. It is a political hot potato because obviously in Australia, investment property is a great way for mum and dads to be able to build their portfolio. 83% of investment properties in Australia are essentially owned by mum and dad investors. They use leverage and they obviously provide an important part of the supply chain for renters. So it is a political hot potato that no one, and it will have impact for our housing market and for renters, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I guess the question is, if you did tinker with it, would it make housing more affordable? I mean, that's the bottom line. That's what they're after.
Yeah.
Or will it encourage more investment, as in the building of more homes? Well, not necessarily. It could be a discouragement for the investors.
It could. Look, I think what we'd probably see is investor flows slow down. We've already seen in Victoria that example where we've seen changes to tax on land, Airbnb taxes, and we've actually seen investors essentially fleeing Victoria. I think that we'd definitely get a slowdown in investor activity. We'd potentially get a slowdown in some investment construction. We've already got a chronic shortfall of housing in the market, and I think a bit of a potential issue as well. Landlords may actually stop investing in their properties, spending on some of the maintenance, so we might actually get a bit of a flow-on effect to existing properties as well. Probably the big problem we've got is there's already a shortage of supply. Will we see a shift towards home ownership, or will that investment money go towards institutional investors and overseas foreign investment and shift away from mum and dads who then look at other opportunities? A good example is New Zealand. 5 years ago, the Ardern government abolished negative gearing and they phased it out for existing investors over 5 years. The biggest impact they've interestingly seen, they saw a slowdown in investor activity. Main thing they saw was an increase in rent. And we've got a little bit of history there now. That was in 21. Their main strain, and the same example was in the UK when they removed some of the tax benefits for investors. What they mainly saw was a shift in rentals going up.
So what is that the landlord try to compensate, given they're not getting that tax break, so they're lifting rents?
I think it's twofold. The landlord's compensating, number one. Number two, there might be less investor stock over time because less investors are purchasing. You've got a supply and demand issue in investment. 30% of Australians rent, and about 30% of Australians' property currently is investment. So there is a supply and demand mismatch, but if we start slowing our investment stock in combination with landlords putting up rentals, that's probably the main impact they've seen overseas.
What role do investors have in the housing supply? Is it the case where broadly retail, investors, mums and dads, are investing in existing stock, whereas the institutional investors that are actually building the housing?
Yeah, that's a fair observation. I think what investment property's done for Australians is it's given them an access point into the market. There's different ways they can do that. There's direct investment, which, as I touched on before, is about 83% of investors. There's the REITs, there's the institutions, but it does provide essentially stock for renters. those institutionals, those mutual funds, they're looking at more those larger scale build to rent programs, which might be the units. They're now looking at some government incentives to free up land, to free up some of the red tape to be able to build them. And obviously the foreign investment takes that money out of Australia. So the role of investment from mum and dads has played a massive part of twofold. Wealth accumulation for people that may not have been able to leverage into investments. They can use gearing. Most investors have their family home. They then use the equity in that to leverage in an investment property. Access to credit's a lot easier, and it's providing stock. Our chronic shortage in supply in Australia is not caused by investors. It's been a long-term issue that's been coming where we're just not keeping up with the demand. We've got massive immigration numbers.
Yeah.
And we've just got a structural issue, essentially.
Well, Anthony, that all said then, how's investor activity looking at the moment? How's particularly loans, what are you seeing there at the moment?
That all said, investor activity's on the up.
Right, okay.
We had a cautious 2023 with rate rises, challenges around holding properties, challenges around funding new properties with cash flow. But I think with rates stabilising, we're seeing credit flows back to where they sit nominally around 35%. We're getting back towards those numbers. In 23, it got as low as 27%. What we aren't quite seeing yet is the investors buying. Again, supply and demand, shortfall of good investor grade properties, but they're getting ready to find those opportunities. They're also using the equity that's been created in over the last couple of years, because the market's obviously back where we were in 2022. So yeah, investor activity is growing. We're seeing that within our business. We're also seeing it in the numbers coming through from recent data from CoreLogic and the ABS in terms of credit flows.